Today is Friday, April 24th, and this is VOA's International Edition. I'm Steve Miller in Washington. Australia calls for reform at the World Health Organization.
What happens at the upper echelons of these organisations and how they operate, I think, is in need of change.
Plus, the challenges Africa faces meeting equipment needs during the pandemic.
And to be acutely aware of just how unprepared the continent is.
And the coronavirus threatens to upend Muslim traditions dating back 1,500 years. Those stories and more are next. A Johns Hopkins University COVID-19 tracker shows there have been over 2.7 million confirmed cases of the disease globally. COVID-19 caused nearly 200,000 deaths. The United States has the most cases with at least 869,000 and about 50,000 deaths attributed to the disease. Spain is a distant second with over 213,000 cases and more than 22,000 deaths. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said his country will cooperate with like-minded countries to change the World Health Organization. Morrison said although Australia continues to support the agency's work in the Pacific region, it agrees with the United States that the WHO needs to be reviewed.
What happens at the upper echelons of these organisations and how they operate, I think, is in need of change. And Australia will continue to advocate for that change with like-minded countries who share our concerns. What ultimate decision the United States ultimately takes on funding will be a matter for them. We will certainly want to see an improved set of arrangements at the WHO, and we'll continue to push for that through the forums as a participant, as a member, as someone who understands and publicly states the value of the work that it does on the ground.
U.S. President Donald Trump directed his administration to freeze WHO funding, saying it did not give adequate early reports on the coronavirus. The WHO announced the launch of a private solidarity rescue fund it hopes will allow private individuals, corporations, and institutions to donate directly to global response efforts. Africa has yet to see the worst of the pandemic that has devastated New York, Italy, and Spain, but the outlook for the continent may be grim. The World Health Organization says Africa has only 5 beds in intensive care units per 100,000 people, while Europe has 4,000 ICU beds per 100,000 people. There are only 2,000 ventilators spread out over 41 African countries. The others have none. Now, to learn more, VOA's Adam Phillips spoke to John Campbell, a senior fellow of African policy studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington and a former U.S. ambassador to Nigeria. He began by summarizing his impression of the African leaders and policymakers he's spoken to.
They tend to be absolutely scared to death. They have seen the horrific pictures coming out of northern Italy, but also out of the public hospitals in New York. And they tend to be acutely aware of just how unprepared the continent is for the onset of the virus.
But unlike New York and most of Italy, most Africans are quite poor.
Yes, and that changes everything. If you're talking about pre-existing conditions, for example, HIV, high blood pressure, diabetes, the whole host of issues that can make the disease fatal.
Not to mention pneumonia, of course, which is another big killer on the continent.
It is indeed. In fact, most of the time, it is the killer that's connected to the virus. I mean, that's what people die of.
Do you think that the devastation that you anticipate in Africa will create more conflict or terrorism there?
Yes. Certain of the jihadi radical groups operating in the Sahel, some of their preachers have said, now is the time to strike. The goal is the destruction of the secular state, and what we are seeing is the inability of the secular state to protect its people. So yes, I would anticipate there will be an upsurge in that kind of terrorism.
Any rays of light on the continent, models that give you some hope?
It's very interesting what has happened in South Africa. The Ramaphosa government imposed a social distancing and quarantine regime, not unlike that in South Korea or in Thailand. And in South Africa, at least for the time being, it appears to be working. The curve is flattening. Here is the danger. The South African government made too little provision for the economic consequences of quarantining amongst the poorest part of the population, for whom quarantining and social distancing and the other strategies that are used in the developed world are impossible. How do you practice social distancing when you are involved in an informal economy that is based on face-to-face contact? How do you carry out hand washing in an environment in which water is so short that you buy it and you use it for drinking? Further, enforcement of quarantining by the security services has been pretty rough. Unless the government is able to address both of these issues, then public support for what would appear to be a strategy that is working is likely to evaporate.
What might the United States do to help Africa?
Two things. We're really, really good at famine relief, at the transport of immense amounts of food very quickly to places that badly need it. And much, particularly in West Africa, but also elsewhere, much of Africa is now in a pre-famine situation. The second thing we're really good at is building very quickly field hospitals. It's what the military did in the last weeks of the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. Huge military field hospitals that we put up in Liberia and other places. And the Africans didn't forget it. It was interesting to watch how the African in the streets views on the Africa Command, AFRICOM, flipped from seeing it as somehow or another an example of U.S. neocolonialism to actually understanding what it was intended for.
John Campbell is a senior fellow for African policy studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington and a former U.S. ambassador to Nigeria. He spoke with VOA's Adam Phillips in New York via Zoom. The coronavirus outbreak threatens to upend Muslim traditions that have been practiced for almost 1,500 years. The pandemic has forced many governments to order unprecedented restrictions on movement, gathering, and collective prayers. VOA's Aisha Tanzim brings us this story of the world's nearly 2 billion Muslims and how they will spend their holiest month of Ramadan, which begins this week.
Kaaba, the holiest of sites for Muslims, usually teeming with worshippers from around the world during Ramadan, is empty. Mosques in Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, have closed their doors to the faithful. Even Masjid al-Nabawi, the mosque of Muhammad, the Muslim prophet, is closed. The government has ordered everyone to pray at home. Muslims around the world are grappling with a similarly grim reality. Their holiest month, usually marked with communal feasts and congregational prayers, will be spent trying to keep their fellow humans at a distance. Their mosques will remain empty, as seen during a special night of prayers pre-Ramadan.
Our mosque used to be overflowing at night. People worshipped all night long. This time I was the sole worshiper on my prayer mat. No one else was around.
Iran's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, one of the most senior leaders of Shiite Islam, has told his followers to offer their prayers in solitude during the month of fasting. The closure of houses of worship is also expected to affect many of the less fortunate. During Ramadan, many mosques turn into soup kitchens for the poor as individuals or groups organize charity tables. Not this year, as Islam El-Sharbani told us via phone from Cairo.
In
the mosque, we used to prepare iftar, the evening meal, for the people who couldn't afford it. We also prepared Ramadan food bags and financial aid to the poor people. With the current crisis, we will decrease somehow, but we hope for the good.
Many are trying to keep the spirit of giving alive through other means.
This year, we cannot organize a charity table, so we have increased food delivery at home because a lot of people have been impacted with this pandemic. Until now, we have delivered more than 2,000 bags of groceries. We will continue this throughout Ramadan.
While many countries have limited intercity travel, the most populous Muslim country, Indonesia, has banned travel altogether for Ramadan. Tens of millions of people wishing to leave big cities for their hometowns will have to spend the holidays away from family. In some Muslim countries, like Pakistan and Afghanistan, governments have bowed to pressure from clergy to keep mosques open, although with safety guidelines. Health officials worry the guidelines will be hard to implement. The day after Ramadan ends is one of the most festive Muslim holidays called Eid al-Fitr. Many Muslim countries have already banned collective Eid prayers and subsequent festivities. Aisha Tanzim, VOA News, Islamabad.
Police used force to disperse Muslims praying at mosques at the start of the holy month of Ramadan Friday for violating government orders not to gather because of the coronavirus. Cameroon has confirmed at least 1,300 COVID-19 infections and 43 deaths, the hardest hit country in West Africa.